today. Yes, my work on modest contributions to the decolonization paradigm started with my doctoral dissertation at Edinburgh University under the supervision of Peter Young, and at the time Beverly Brown was contributing advice, and later David Garland also contributed advice when my main supervisor was away on sabbatical. I want to thank them all. And also I want to thank my colleagues at Liverpool John Moores University, Josine, Steve Toombs, and Pete Gill, and others for encouraging and supporting me when I was turning that dissertation into a book. Black Women and the Criminal Justice System became the book that launched the Ashgate Publishers series on ethnic, gender, and class relations, with me as series editor, until Ashgate was bought by Taylor and Francis, and now the books in my series are being reissued by Routledge under their Routledge Revivals series. The main points that I've made in the book on Black women and the criminal justice system is to includes the challenging of the criminological assumption that crime and punishment usually go together. So the focus of criminology is the punishment of offenders. The very first 4 words in the influential text by David Garland, Punishment and Modern Society, indicating a punitive turn in criminological theory. I was led to challenge that assumption because I found in my own research that a lot of the Black women who were treated as if they were offenders were not offenders. They were simply close or proximate to suspected Black men. And I couldn't find similar instances where Black men were targeted by law enforcement because they were close to suspected Black women. I couldn't find similar instances where white women were also targeted because they were close to suspected white men, except in the case of Irish women who were targeted because they were close to suspected IRA suspects. But in that case, there was a war between IRA and the British government, whereas there was no war between Black women and the British government at the time I was doing my research. So I wanted to explore what criminologists would call the punishment of the innocent or party, as opposed to the punishment of offenders, which are summarized as pool, the pool theory, and the party. But I found in criminology that there was no theory as such of the punishment of the innocent. Rather, such would be understood as miscarriages of justice, whereas on the street, people will regard such treatment as victimization rather than punishment. The closest I found in criminology would be the work of Habermas, who talked about the colonization of the life word by economic power, monetary power, and how to decolonize the, oh, no, he didn't talk about the decolonization, and that's where I came in. He only noted that economic power was in the process of colonizing judicial power and the life word. He didn't go beyond that to then address decolonization, nor did he address the history of actually existing colonization and decolonization struggles, as Edward Said pointed out in Culture and Imperialism. Similarly, Foucault didn't talk about colonization and anti-colonial struggles in his work, Discipline and Punish. But Foucault would say that he was simply concerned with the history of Western Europe and not with the history of the world. And to that, Edward Said responded that you cannot do a history of Western Europe without addressing the colonization of the world by Europeans. Another related insight was that of Hector on internal colonialism, where he talked about the British Isles as being an internally colonized area for the Scots and the Welsh, because they were within the British nation, as it were. The Hector was wrong, because there is no such thing as a British nation, because Britain, the UK, is a multinational nation state. And Hector's idea came from South America. It came from African Americans who were theorizing their condition, the conditions of African Americans in the US, as that of an internal colony that needed to be studied from the point of view of Frantz Fanon, the wretched of the earth. They struggle against colonial violence by the colonized. And that was what was going on here in the US and also in South America, where even after 200 years of political independence from colonialism, there is still internal colonialism for the indigenous people and for the people of African descent who were enslaved in South America. Looking at the internal colonialism from Hector, we can borrow it a little to talk about the internal colonization of victimization by the expanding power of the empire of punishment, or the law's empire, as some would call it. We need to do this so that theoretically, at least, we will not be confusing what is dished out as punishment with what is dished out as victimization. That is important, especially from the point of view of Black women who were treated as offenders, even though they were innocent, simply because they were close to suspected men. But we need to go beyond the conceptual decolonization that I've just talked about and address the issues facing a lot of the formerly colonized countries that are now neo-colonial, but embrace the colonial laws imposed by the colonizers, even after the colonizers had abolished such laws in their own jurisdictions. You find this in the Caribbean, in South America, across Africa, and across Asia. I owe it to one of my colleagues, Onwudiwe, who reviewed that book, Black Women and the Criminal Justice System, and found that it was laying the foundation for a new paradigm in criminology, the paradigm of decolonization, which was the subtitle of the book, Towards the Decolonization of Victimization. And I think he was right. In the Fanonian theory of colonization that is adopted into criminology, you find that there is some work on the colonial model or the Fanonian model, that not on the decolonization struggle that Fanon was contributing to. Because once you recognize that there is a colonial situation, the next step forward is to address the struggles for decolonization. And that was the originality of my modest contribution to that theory. Of course, like any other scholarly work, I did not do this work all by myself. I mean, it's my independent work, but I had influences, including above all, Stewart Hall, whom I bumped into along Kilburn High Road in London while I was doing field work for this research. And he kindly invited me to his study nearby and told me that what I was talking about was articulation, because I told him that I wasn't going to talk only about racism against Black women or class exploitation or gender oppression. I wanted to talk about all three in my research. And he jumped at it and told me that's articulation. I said, well, but articulation is for the mode of production type of analysis. And he smiled and told me, yes, you can abstract it from the mode of production and apply it to social relations. So he gave me the book by UNESCO, Sociological Theory and Race, in which he had that big chapter on race, articulation, and society structured in dominance. And that kind of set me straight theoretically. I also want to acknowledge the work of Paul Gilroy in There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, and also his essay at the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham, Stepping Out of Babylon, where he talked about a lot about the anti-colonial struggles in the Caribbean and in Africa and Asia before some of those people who participated in those struggles emigrated into the UK, apparently to continue the struggle, to build alliances and to build coalitions, to the extent that the people from Asia accepted for a while to be included in the category Black, because if you were not white, you were Black. Though later, the Asians resisted being called Black and preferred to be called Asian, a point that Gilroy makes in There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. All that led to my second book, Counter-Colonial Criminology, based mainly on my lecture notes at Liverpool John Moores University in the criminological theory class that I co-taught with Josim and others. What I found in that book was that the kind of critique that I was making about criminology in general can also be made about critical criminology and even feminist criminology, because to a great extent, they also ignored the history of colonialism and the struggles against colonialism as offering lessons to criminology in general. That history is represented mainly by the essay by David Galland, one of my supervisors, on the history of criminology as an established discipline in the UK. And he traced that from 1959 with the establishment of the Cambridge Institute of Criminology, where I actually started this research for my MPhil in law under the supervision of Colin Sumner, who made some contribution, and also under the mentorship of Alison Morris, who was very kind to me with advice. I find that counter-colonial criminology has been supported a lot by my colleagues around the world, and lots of work is coming out now that is supportive of that book, including Colonial Systems of Control by Saleh Hanna, who spent some time in Nigeria working with groups that support prisoners in Nigeria. And she included 2 essays by me in her book, Colonial Systems of Control, and has gone on to offer some original work on the music of Fela Kuti as something that criminologists could use, the same way that Gilroy uses reggae music, Stepping Out of Babylon being one of those songs by Marcia Griffiths that was a top chart bursting tune. And Vivian Selahana also has a theory of ontology that would encourage the abolition of the category that we call crime, so that it's no longer used as the excuse for the oppression of the less privileged. Another book of interest would be Global Lockdown by Opara is the name now, who kindly included my chapter on women in prison in Nigeria, making me the only man who contributed to that book about the global lockdown of women around the world, especially women of color. I'm very grateful for that influence. But the guiding policy orientation for most of my work could be found in the withering away of the law thesis, which David Garland talks about or reviews in his book, Punishment and Modern Society, focusing on the contributions of Pashukanis on the withering away of the law, the withering away of the state thesis. If you read it in the original and reflect on it, criminologists are not really very interested in that thesis because the law is not in a great hurry to wither away. Even in the socialist countries where the withering away of the law thesis originated. That's if we go back to the work of Engels on the origin of the family, private property, and the state, where he argued that the state would eventually wither away in a communist society. And Pashukanis was reviewing that work and predicting that the capitalist or bourgeois law would wither away. No, socialist law would wither away, but that bourgeois law would have to be abolished the way that Lenin theorized it in State and Revolution. But maybe because of that prediction, Joe Stalin disappeared Pashukanis because it was maybe a direct critique of the increasing criminalization under the Bolsheviks rather than the withering away of the law. But if we pause to think about it, we'll find that some of the laws, at least, have started to wither away. And I'll come to that in a bit. But we do have a journal now in New Zealand at the Auckland University of Technology called Decolonizing Criminology and Justice. And I'm happy to say that I am on the editorial board, and I also presented an inaugural lecture that was published in the first issue of the journal. So that is an indication to us that the decolonization paradigm is coming of age and is getting a lot more support now around the world. I thank my colleagues who support that kind of work going forward. There is also a book called Indigenous Criminology, something that we never heard about, say, in the previous 20 years or forever, until Chris Kunin and Juan Tauri brought out that book, which offers some significant support to the counter-colonial criminology and decolonization paradigm thesis in criminology, but opens a new avenue for addressing the immense colonial and imperialist wrongs done to indigenous people with the support of criminology, as I argued in counter-colonial criminology. Criminology is a discipline designed for the control of others, especially decolonized others. And more recently, you find the work by Lag and Anthony on decolonizing criminology, a very big book that is, again, supportive of my work. And for that, I'm grateful to them for their generosity. Beyond criminology to sociology, you find that this work is also being recognized in what is known as liberation sociology, offered by Joe Figgin and his colleagues, who say that we should go beyond public sociology and begin to talk about what they call liberation sociology, that is activist sociology, aiming to make the world a better place. In Critical Criminology, the journal, Dimu and others have argued that there is a southern turn in criminology or southernizing turn in criminology, but that southernizing turn still needs to be decolonized. So I find that supportive. And Leon Musavi, who also offered a friendly critique of the Southern turn by warning that we shouldn't allow it to become an excuse for the hegemonization of settler colonial scholars in criminology as Southern criminology, while still marginalizing the indigenous voices and colonized voices in criminology. Race and crime, where he talks about contributions to understanding the situation of people of African descent in criminology. And I'm grateful to him because he gave almost 10 pages to a discussion of my work in that paradigm. But when the book was published, Counter-Colonial Criminology, there was a roundtable panel at the American Society of Criminology, where my colleagues were able to offer rave reviews of the book. And those views were then collected and published in the first volume of the African Journal of Criminology and Justice Studies, of which I am the series editor for the African Criminology and Justice Association. But other rave reviews followed, especially the one by Maureen Kane in the Howard Journal, where she maybe offered a mild critique by saying that the book read like an angry text, which is perhaps an advice for me not to sound too angry when I'm presenting my views. But I don't think I was angry in that text. I was just being critical without being angry. And Kitosa has applied the same paradigm to Canada to show that it is not only for Africa or for the former colonized countries, but even in colonial situations, especially internal colonialism, that counter-colonial criminology will be very much needed. My colleague in Australia, Maria Giannakopoulos, has a chapter in Deathscape by Joseph Pugliese and others, where she talks about the crimes of settler colonialism against indigenous people and the need to continue the struggle for decolonization. And the work of Steve Box on crime, power, and mystification, where he argues that the belief among most criminologists on the left and the right is not supported by the facts. They view that the poor are more likely to be criminals, that poverty is the major cause of crime. And Steve Box says, no, there is no evidence to support that, because a lot of rich people commit serious crimes, and the vast majority of the poor are overwhelmingly law-abiding. You find that conclusion also in the work of Ryman and Layton. The rich get richer and the poor get prison, not because the poor are more crime-prone, but because the rich are able to hire dream teams of lawyers to defend them even when they are guilty. So all that led me to the work of Angela Davis. Almost everything he has written is a contribution to the decolonization paradigm, especially her 2005 book, Abolition Democracy, where she follows the work of W.B. Du Bois to address the continuing of slavery by any other means in the US, but also around the world, calling for the abolition of prisons, the abolition of war, poverty, homophobia, racism. Can we all imagine a world without prisons? Can we imagine a world without war? A world without poverty, without homophobia, without sexism, without racism would be a more humane world in her view. And we should all strive to end what her colleague, our colleague, called the Golden Gulag. And that might be regarded as a form of utopia. And that's what my students tell me when I assign this topic to them in an exam, to imagine a more humane world. They will tell me it's only a utopia. However, if we look at the withering away of marijuana law around the world, we find that it's not so utopian, because the people themselves are pushing for the decolonization and the ending of the war on drugs, because it is a war on the people by the capitalist state. We can use education definitely to get people to say no to drugs without having to criminalize them the way we have been doing under the punishment of offenders and the imperialist reason in criminology. You can also look at the women's right to choose as a fundamental human right, as something that was unheard of maybe 100 years ago when women couldn't even vote, right? So now we find that very many jurisdictions have allowed women the right to choose, just like men have the right to choose their own healthcare. And the sky has not fallen just because women got the right to choose. But in some states, say in the United States, you find that the morality police are still active in trying to deny women the right to reproductive health care. So the struggle continues. And across Africa is the same thing. Perhaps only a few countries in Africa would have a woman's right to choose. Whereas in countries like Senegal and Cameroon, especially the former countries colonized by France, the Napoleonic laws are still in place on the books to make abortion a criminal offense. And lots of women are ending up in prison for it. So the struggle continues. Across Africa, I'm suggesting that there should be complete abolition of the war on drugs to allow women to have the right to grow marijuana and sell it to feed their families. I made this recommendation because I found that more than 90% of the Black women who were in prison for drugs in the UK were in prison for drugs offenses. I mean, yeah, for drugs offenses. And if those drugs were legal, then there would be hardly any Black woman in prison in the UK. The South Asian countries used the war on drugs to execute a lot of people from Africa. Okay, they execute their own citizens too, but that's no excuse for executing lots of Africans in Southeast Asia for drugs offenses, when Africans have never executed even a single Asian since Adam and Eve. And criminologists have kept quiet about this scandal until more recently, when young graduate students at the University of Oxford have started addressing the racism in the war on drugs in Southeast Asia. So we need to regard the decolonization paradigm not simply as drawing lessons from the anti-colonial struggles in Africa, in Asia, in South America, but also to see it as an ongoing struggle, especially because there is an intent by the colonizing countries to recolonize the world. And therefore, the struggle for decolonization would have to continue, as Edward Said put it, in Culture and Imperialism. How much time do I have? I think I should stop there, and then maybe we'll have more time for discussion. But feel free to challenge me on any of these ideas, and I will be very happy to elaborate. Thank you.
I would say you have 5 minutes to wrap up if you'd like. If you'd like to take 5 minutes.
Okay, so in the next 5 minutes?
Yes.
Let me then end with a policy proposal that comes out from my work, and that is the proposal that we learn from our societies that before they were colonized, that they didn't have prisons for thousands of years. And if we could run orderly societies without prisons for thousands of years, then we can do it again. We can do it in Africa, in Asia, and even in Europe itself, where, for example, the Netherlands country has been closed in prisons because they don't have enough prisoners due to what they call the rise in civility. That is one point. But on the other point, Africans have suffered unique crimes against them unmatched by any other group in the world, including 400 years of being hunted and kidnapped, transported for enslavement. Many of them killed, millions killed in the process. But Africans are not asking for punishment against Europe and North America for those crimes. Rather, Africans and people of African descent are asking for reparations, or what I call reparative justice, as the final stage of the decolonization struggle. So that's not a rare experience by people of African descent. Remember, they also went through apartheid for many decades, and they came out from apartheid without seeking punishment for the crimes of apartheid. They simply held a Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings. I think the error in the Truth and Reconciliation formula is that it doesn't have truth, reconciliation, and justice. So that justice should have been added to it in the form of reparative justice to recognize the wrongs done to the victimized and do something for the victimized, rather than simply do something against the offenders. So you find that this is something that is unique to people of African descent, the ability or willingness to forgive immense crimes against humanity and not seek revenge or retaliation. Derrida, who was born in Africa, pointed this out when he reviewed the philosophy of forgiveness in the religions of the book, the religion of Judaism, Christianity, and the religion of Islam. Each one has some teachings in favor of forgiveness, but each one of them makes an exception, except for that which is unforgivable. Whereas Africans believe that there is no such thing as unforgivable offenses. Derrida says that the only thing worth forgiving is the unforgivable. But Desmond Tutu responded that indirectly that there is nothing unforgivable, that everything is forgivable under the philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because we are. So a lot of the crimes we have on the book could be addressed through forgiveness. And Africans lead the way in showing that even when something is seen as unforgivable, it can be forgiven. So the punitive turn in criminology originated by David Garland, following Durkheim and maybe Weber, would not be a universal belief that punishment always follows criminality. Sometimes, very often, forgiveness follows offending or criminality. And we can talk about this a little more if people are interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Biko. That was a very well-rounded and expansive way of introducing the idea of counter-colonial criminology to the group. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask the first couple of questions. I was especially struck by the response of some of your students when they identified, when they implied or suggested that the ideas of abolition might be akin to utopia. I wonder what some of the reasons were, because when I listened to that, I thought about the importance of imagination in criminology, and to think beyond what you call imperialist reason, but to think beyond the taken for granted. And so, and the role of power in establishing certain kinds of ideas, so that imagination is stymied and we just sort of accept what's offered on the palette. So in the Canadian context, for instance, you mentioned the idea of abolition. So marijuana, was legalized in 2018. And it struck me as interesting that it has become now quite an elite enterprise where the racialized and marginalized working classes who were previously incarcerated for marijuana production and marketing are now the ones who are marginalized from the processes of whatever benefits one can get from the legal marketization of marijuana. So I wonder what some of the reasons your students would have given for believing abolition to be akin to utopia.
Yes, I think the students are mostly in criminology, people who want to become law enforcement officers or correctional officers. And one of the reservations they have is, if we abolish criminology, abolish prisons, then where is the job for us? So they're being self-interested in that way, and that's all right too. But I reassure the students that if the prisons did not exist, that doesn't mean you would be jobless. You could be funded to start your own farm or become a writer or do some other things. You're not going to be completely unemployed. But it is true that most people find it difficult to imagine the end of capitalism as a system of production, even though capitalism did not always exist. It only emerged at a certain point in history, as Marx said. But we, as sociologists or scholars, find it very difficult to imagine that, well, utopia, Marx didn't regard it as a utopia, but even if it is utopian, my supervisor at Edinburgh University wrote a very interesting paper for the British Journal of Criminology to say that utopias are really very good ways to think theoretically. You shouldn't completely rule them out from criminology. And so my students who don't have the ability to imagine an end to prisons or to the police or to repressive imperialist policies are simply following the common sense, the media views that these institutions have come to stay and there are no alternatives. And when I taught a class on the legalization of marijuana way back in 2012, before the wave of legalizations, the students challenged me, not my students, but some students on campus challenged me to a debate on the legalization of marijuana in Virginia. And they call themselves Young Republicans for Freedom, Young Americans for Freedom, but they are the youth wing of the Republican Party. And I kind of told them that Young Americans for Freedom should be for more freedom rather than more restrictions to the freedom of law-abiding citizens. And that I hope that here in Virginia, the law will be changed to make marijuana a legal substance and clean the records of those who have been convicted of marijuana felonies so that they can now get jobs, vote, and get housing if they need to. So the point you make about reparative justice for people whose lives were ruined by the law against marijuana is an important one, and we should continue to make that demand, even in Canada, especially in Canada, where a lot of indigenous people of African descent, were overrepresented in the prosecution for marijuana offenses. Now the government needs to give them grants and give them land to begin to participate in the legal economy on equal footing with the big capitalist firms that are moving in that direction. So that's our problem here too in Virginia, because the law that legalized marijuana included some reparative measures that could give back people's or clean their criminal records. And that is something that President Biden has just done by pardoning 6,000 people who were convicted of federal marijuana offenses. But a lot of the offenses are at the state and local levels. They need to do the same. And for that to be done, the federal government will have to change the law and recognize that marijuana is the safest drug known to humanity, according to scientists.
Very interesting. I want to pass the questions over to the floor. Guys, feel free to jot down your questions in the chat. If you're a bit shy, to raise your hand, or you can raise your hand and ask Biko a question. There's a question in the chat from Moses Osiro. Moses asks, in what ways does the decolonizing paradigm problematize crime as a concept beyond decriminalizing certain offenses?
Yes, that's an interesting question, because as I mentioned earlier, my colleague Vivian Salehana talks about the abolition of crime, not just abolition of prisons or defunding of the police. And by that, she means that the withering away of the law thesis needs to be pursued more in criminology, because some of the laws are, at least some of the laws, the criminal laws, are not necessary for maintaining an orderly society based on love. We can use that principle that is found in the New Testament, from all according to their ability and to all according to their need, which Marx and Engels adopted as a principle of socialism, that we don't need to punish people for them to follow the law if we are fair in the structures of the society to all members of the society. Then people can indeed follow the law without having to be punished to make them to follow the law. So yes, the category crime is the easiest way to reduce crime around the world, by abolishing the criminal law. But for us to be able to do that, we will need to have to put in place a system of government and mode of production that takes care of everybody. It doesn't mean that there will be no more wrongdoing, but those wrongdoings will be treated as civil wrongs rather than as criminal wrongs to be punished. I say this because when the corporations commit huge crimes that result in the death of a lot of people, nobody is punished. Say for here in America, every year about 100,000 people die from opioid overdose. But nobody has gone to prison for it. Rather, the families that own those pharmaceutical companies that manufacture opioid medication were made to pay fines to some states, but nobody went to prison for it. The same thing with big tobacco. Tobacco jurisprudence means that nobody has gone to prison, even though tobacco kills 6 million people every year around the world. But it's not a crime. It is something that Cannon and Toombs, Hilliard and Frank Pierce would call semiology, the study of harm. Because some of those things are not regarded as crime, doesn't mean that they don't do any harm to society. Rather, they are treated as tort, as harm that can be dealt with through a fine, through reparative justice, but not through punitive justice. That is something we need to recognize as a possibility going forward, that we can live without a criminal law as we did for thousands of years before we were colonized, and simply find ways of correcting wrong behavior in the community.
Okay, I'll ask another question here. in conjunction with Moses's question about the concept of crime, I also have a problem with the concept of crime because it's a quite narrow lens. And I gravitate towards the concept of harm within the approach of semiology. The idea, for instance, I use the Canadian context because Canada is one of my case studies and I'm also Canadian. So for instance, with Indigenous communities, the arable land is often under threat because of illegal dumping of substances from corporations that just basically have carte blanche to, essentially there are no criminal laws to pinpoint the harms that dumping chemicals on Indigenous land will do to the water systems. So for the past 30 years, there have been water advisories, clean water advisories, essentially meaning that a country in the global south has populations of people who have no clean water coming in. So what role do you think what's the relationship, do you think, that harm, the concept of harm has with the methodology of decolonization?
Yes, the contributions from colleagues who are studying semiology can be seen to support the decolonization paradigm. Frank Pierce and Steve Toombs have done research in India around the issue of the Bhopal tragedy, where an American company set up a carbide factory in India, and the explosion due to negligence led to very many deaths, but nobody went to prison, right? And I think Dave White also analyzed the war in Iraq to show how corporations profited from the corruption around the world, but nobody has been charged or nobody's going to jail for it. So I believe that when there are such harms that cannot be treated as crimes because the people who commit them are the powerful people who basically make the law and enforce them and would not be going to jail for those activities, then we should treat them as harm and use reparative justice rather than punitive justice to address those wrongs and harms done to large numbers of people. And that's a point that Steve Box also makes in Crime, Power, and Mystification, chapter 1. It talks about the bombing of millions of people by Western powers in developing countries. Why is that not treated as a crime? And it's not necessary to treat it as crimes and be punished and make the punishment fit the crime, because there is no punishment that will fit 400 years of the enslavement of Africans or the genocide against indigenous people around the world. Rather, we can continue to demand for reparative justice, the way people in the Caribbean, North America, and in Africa have been demanding, and also in Australia and New Zealand, for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I have a commentary in the chat from Deborah Travis, who says, unfortunately, the criminal justice system in America has not changed a lot over the years. Blacks are still disproportionately jailed for crimes compared to the majority, some due to lack of legal representation, which I think is very interesting. The idea that we have a system of justice, but there's no real interrogation about the differentiations that are built into the system. But a lot due to systemic racism and discrimination that still exists. Now, many of us here are either or both. We're teachers or we're researchers, and we face the community when we research, because we have to go out and sort of effectively get stories that will substantiate the research that we do to support our social justice and activism efforts. But we're also teachers, and we're in classrooms. And for me, this is an interesting sticking point, because I have down the middle this. Please feel free to raise your hands, folks, if you have a question, or jot them in the chat. So for me, the issue that I think is quite constant is that those conversations with my students, and On the one hand, you noted something that I also note, that the resistance or reticence of students who say, well, what else can we do? The imagination is that if we abolish the police, we will be overrun. Effectively, we are left defenseless. And on the other hand, I have students in the same classrooms who say, well, somehow I am targeted as the ideal criminal, even though I've done nothing wrong. And the content of my textbooks, my articles that I read, pinpoints me as a profile of criminality, which I find to be quite interesting. So how do you respond to your classrooms? I know we talked about the students who talked about utopia, but what case studies do you bring to your classrooms to emphasize a sort of reality, an alternate reality, a counterfactual about where this can go?
Okay, thank you, Esmori. I tell my students that Black Lives Matter. And it's not an issue only for Black people. There are lots of white people who are in support of Black Lives Matter. There were demonstrations all over the world when George Floyd was murdered. Black people, white people, Asian people participated because they recognize that police brutality is not an issue only for Black people. So I tell my students and I tell my colleagues in Australia this too, but it's difficult to persuade people to listen to it. The Aboriginal Australians are the most overrepresented people in prison anywhere in the world. But they make up only 27% of the prison population. That tells you that poor white Australians make up more than 70% of the prison population. If poor white Australians knew that, they would have rallied more in support of Black deaths in custody in Australia, because unknown to them, the majority of people who are killed in police custody in Australia are white. Same thing in New Zealand, where the Maori are overrepresented. The poor white New Zealanders make up about 30% of the prison population in New Zealand. That's a lot. And here in the US, where Travis Deborah is referring to, you find that African Americans are overrepresented, about 4 times more likely to go to prison than poor whites. But in absolute numbers, white Americans make up 30% of the prison population, and African Americans make up 34% of the prison population. Now think about it. It is almost equal representation of Black and white in American prisons. If poor white Americans knew that, they would be rallying more in support of Black Lives Matter, because racism is a threat to all. It's not only a threat to people of African descent. I think Martin Luther King Jr. may have prophesied this in that "I Have a Dream" speech. There is a line where he says, Blacks, whites, Jews, and Gentiles, we will go to jail together. And that's happening now. But the poor whites don't know it. They think that police brutality affects only Black people. But when you look at the records of people who were killed by the police, the vast majority of those who are killed by the police are white people in America. Maybe because there are more white people to be killed. In other words, every year the police kills 1,000 people in the US. Half of that will be white. 250 will be Black. That is overrepresenting Black people. We know that. But in absolute numbers, poor white people are catching hell too. But they don't know it because of the psychological and social wages of whiteness. If you're white, you are right. It doesn't happen like that in reality, because as Bob Marley said, when the rain falls, it will not fall on one man's housetop. That is why we all need to come together to oppose authoritarian populism. When Margaret Thatcher withdrew milk from public schools. She didn't withdraw them only from the children of immigrants. She withdrew them from all children. So poor children would go without milk under Thatcherism. And that was quite the point that Stewart Hall was making in authoritarian populism, that we need to build coalitions and alliances because the threat is not only against poor Black people, it's against all poor people.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Lizzie.
Yes, Lizzie.
Hello, thanks for your talk. Sorry, I look a bit spooky. It's gone dark while we've been listening to the seminar. I just wanted to return to a point that you made earlier in the talk about the links between, let's say, criminology in European countries, kind of understanding and confronting the relevance of its colonial past, and how that creates a bunch of international links in terms of, you know, all kinds of things, but criminal justice systems and systems of punishment. What work do we need to do as criminologists to get this more widely recognized and including within the discipline? I mean, obviously, like, there's the work you've done, but perhaps what are some of the research agendas we need to be pursuing?
Yes, I think it's an important question. And it's not just a research agenda that we need to concern ourselves with, but activism for social justice that many of us are engaged in. That is the paradigm in Black studies or Africana studies that we need to be, we need to go beyond scholarship to also do activism in support of our agenda. For example, I'm against the death penalty, but I don't just write essays about it. You know, when the country of the Gambia wanted to execute 37 people at a go, I had sent them some of my research and told them, number one, Africans didn't make the law requiring the death penalty. The British imposed the law during colonialism, and the British have since ended executions as punishment in the UK. So what are you doing, wanting to execute 37 Africans at once? And the country suspended the mass execution. I hope that my intervention helped in some way, because there were other people who were intervening, including Jesse Jackson. And here in America, when I came here, juveniles could be sentenced to death penalty. And I had to make a representation to the Supreme Court of the state of Pennsylvania to tell them that you can't allow this to continue, because 6 out of 7 people on juvenile death row were African Americans. So the racism was clearly visible. And soon after I made that presentation, the US Supreme Court ruled that juvenile death penalty was unconstitutional. So I hope again that my research contributed to that. And in the Caribbean, while I was there for 3 years, I was campaigning against the criminalization of marijuana. And some of my colleagues thought I was crazy, that I could get fired for saying things like that. But now it's happening across the Caribbean. I hope African countries will also follow suit. I hope the UK will. What is the UK doing criminalizing marijuana, but allowing tobacco and allowing alcohol that kills a lot more people? Why are they using that as an excuse to incarcerate lots of people of African descent? We shouldn't allow that to continue. We shouldn't allow African continents to continue to deny women the right to choose abortion if they want to. It's a crime across Africa, and a lot of women are dying at the hands of quacks. So we need to support them. But above all, people of African descent are demanding for reparative justice and recognition of the crimes of slavery and apartheid and colonialism. We all should contribute to that by supporting them in our scholarly work, but also by supporting activists who are making such demands. Yes. So there is a lot to be done in the decolonization paradigm, including, of course, looking at the withering away of the lattices, the defunding of the police, so that we can make more resources available for community interventions. And Angela Davis argues for that. I support Angela Davis on abolition democracy.
Thank you very much for that. We have another comment or question in the chat from Moses. He asks, how would reparative justice effectively tackle gender-based violence given its embeddedness in unequal power relations? So the idea that reparative justice is embedded in unequal power relations, am I correct, Moses?
Yes, Moses Osiro, thank you for that question. It is a very important question to raise because gender-based violence is found in all sections of society, not only among the poor. That is part of the reason why I agree with Steve Box that it is not poverty that causes crime, it is power and the abuse of power. Even among the poor, those who are more likely to abuse or do violence against women and children will be the adults who have the physical power to do so. And therefore, power is more of a cause of crime than poverty. The vast majority of the poor are overwhelmingly law-abiding. But when you come to gender-based violence that could lead to divorce, you find that it's not really always punished using punitive law. Rather, there is alimony, there is child support payment that are required to support the former victims of domestic violence. Of course, it can lead to prison, basically, where criminal charges are filed. But in most cases, and this is a point made by Carol Smart, the best lawyers in family law are not the ones who are looking for a win, because there is nobody who wins in a family law. Rather, they're trying to find the best solution or best support for the children and the women in the family. Sometimes the man is the one who is facing gender-based violence, but it's not as common as women and children facing gender-based violence. So that can be done through reparative justice by requiring alimonies, by requiring child support. And many men are happy to pay child support because if the children are living with you, you will still support them with your money, maybe even spend more supporting those children. And so some men are a bit foolish by saying, okay, I paid the statutory child support, but I'm going to pay extra to my children directly because I love them and nobody can tell me not to pay to my children. If people knew that, that is, if we teach love, not only war, we would find that a lot more men will be less likely to use gender-based violence to get their way in our society. I say this because there is no institute or school anywhere in the world where love is taught. We are supposed to know it by our DNA, but there are many war colleges, elite war colleges around the world teaching people how to kill. And some of those people who are taught to be killers return to our community and use the same violence against their own children and against their spouses and against themselves. Frantz Fanon shows this in The Wretched of the Earth, where the French officer who was in charge of torturing Africans would go home and torture his wife and children too. So Fanon would be asked to go and treat the officer because the officer had gone crazy. And Fanon said, this is an impossible job. I quit. I'm going to join the Africans and fight for decolonization. So that's something that is worrying a lot of us. How do we improve the relations in our own communities to even prevent the gender-based violence from occurring? And nobody knows for sure what is the formula, but Martin Luther King Jr. called for the beloved community to be constructed. And Malcolm X, when he was minister, if he heard that you beat your wife or girlfriend, he will expel you from the mosque because he would not tolerate gender-based violence. And such things we can do by teaching more love, having maybe if what what I have called love studies, teaching people how to love one another and get by without violence. But it would also need to address the violence done by the state and corporations that are gender-based violence. Say here in the US, when you remove the right of women to access reproductive health care, that is gender-based violence. But nobody's gonna go to jail for it. Rather, we're seeking reparative justice that would restore a woman's right to choose and give support to reproductive health care at the taxpayer's expense, rather than allow women to be routinely murdered by quacks because the procedure has been made illegal across the United States.
I'm reminded of the allegory of the chicken that you use in counter-colonial criminology. The idea that what can happen if you stand by and not get involved. And I work with a concept called of corrosiveness. And one of the things that strikes me is that there are people who think that they are outside the fray when it comes to marginalization and abuse of power. There are people who believe that certain things cannot happen to them or to the populations to which they belong. And I mean, my response to this would be just to look at what's happening with the cost of living crisis. Certainly, there are the usual suspects who are the most impacted. But this thing called neoliberalism is a kind of corrosion that shows the spread of power and how power and effectively corrosion is no respect for a person. So when you have a system that's corrosive, it does not circumvent certain people and touch only other people. It eventually reaches out and touches everyone. So the analogy of the chicken, of not becoming involved, ignoring things that happen, not attending the meeting to be a decision maker, I think is a very important one. So guys, do we have any further questions? I'll take the chair's prerogative again and ask another question. In regards to what we talk about when we talk about reparative justice, what do you think the role of forgiveness? What do you think is the role of forgiveness in moving beyond the adversarial nature of the system that we have? And what the examples that you give really highlight the adversarial nature of the system, the idea that what starts at the top trickles down to families. So when you train men to be soldiers, you train them to torture people, and then you send them home. They go home to people who they continue to torture, even though they're their loved ones. So what do you think the role of, what role do you think for forgiveness plays, especially within the context of restorative justice?
Well, that's a very important question to raise, and your concept of corrosiveness probably is a good analogy to use in describing it. The system is broken, maybe because of the rusts in the system, but also because the legal system that we have was designed deliberately for the control of others, not for the control of those who made the laws, the people who tend to live above the law as if they are above the law. So in reparative justice, we should recognize the fact that wrongs may still continue to occur, that we don't have to punish or rely on punishment every time the way the punitive turn in criminology code theory assumes, the punishment of offenders, or pool theory, as I call it. In other words, there are lots of examples that we can tell of people not being punished when they do something wrong. I think Japan has illustrated this more than any other country, because about 19 8% of people who go to court in Japan are convicted, but about 98% of the time, the punishment is suspended for 5 years. And if you don't do anything wrong in those 5 years, they will completely clean your slate and you start afresh as somebody who never did anything wrong. As a result of that, since World War II, the prison population in Japan has been declining. At the same time, the crime rates has been declining in Japan because of their use of forgiveness. But I think the more common examples, because Japan is still punitive, they still have the capital punishment, etc., would be what Nelson Mandela did with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was borrowed by the country of Colombia to address the crimes committed during the 50 years of guerrilla warfare on both sides. But the people voted against that in a referendum. They said, no, we don't want to forgive. We want some people to be punished for the crimes that they committed. But the president at that time pushed on to implement the truce and got a Nobel Prize for Peace for doing so. Mandela, of course, got a Nobel Prize for doing similar work. But look at what happened in Palestine between the Palestine Liberation Organization and Israel. Prior to the Oslo Agreement, the PLO couldn't open an office in the West Bank or Gaza Strip, but now they are recognized as an authority, legal authority, openly policing their communities. It doesn't mean that there is complete peace between Israel and the Palestinians, but such a situation is unimaginable before Oslo Agreement. And Edward Said said that what he prefers to see is a single state solution where Jews and Israel and the Palestinians would live side by side the same way they did for thousands of years and have one country, maybe with a federal structure, just like the United States, rather than two countries, because one of those two countries is not viable to imagine. And you find it in Australia, where the indigenous people have the story of the giant frog that drank all the water available and left all the other animals and plants to die of thirst. And all the animals got together and called a meeting to decide what to do with the giant frog. So somebody said, let's spear him, spear his stomach and break it so that the water will gush out. But an elder said, no, let's not spear him. Let's spare him. Let us tickle him. And when he laughs, the water will come out. So they tickled him, the water came out, nobody was punished. You find that also among the Maori, because they had a treaty with the crown. They call it Treaty of Waitangi. And what the Maori promised to do was to share their land and share their knowledge with the colonizers. But the colonizers came and took all the land and built prisons to put the Maori. But the Maori are not looking for punishment. They're not seeking to send the colonizers back to where they came from. They still want to share their land and their knowledge with the colonizers. Same thing with the American Indian natives, but also the same thing with the Igbo of Nigeria, who suffered a major genocide from 1967 to 1970, orchestrated by the Labour Party government of Harold Wilson, that supplied all the weapons and helped to blockade food from coming into the land so that starvation was used as a legitimate weapon of war. The Igbo never looked for revenge. They simply asked for reparative justice to address the wrongs done to the survivors of Biafra war. Now, those are good models. They're not perfect, but they are good models to let us know that it is not utopian to talk about the abolition of prisons and abolition of punishment. The use of reparative justice is rather common, but not always of interest to criminologists. Thank you. Yes, Maury.
Pardon me, I was muted. Pardon me, there, it was going to happen at some point. So in response to the sort of interesting bits of knowledge that you've shared, I'm struck by the idea, first of all, of the idea in the context of punishment or statutory responses to what they consider to be deviant behavior. I'm struck by the idea that we are convinced through the media that it is us, the voters, who vote for politicians who introduce more punitive measures. To what extent is that really what we vote for? And why would we vote for more punitive measures and not something like policies that work in the favor of populations rather than to subvert or to marginalize populations?
Yes, I think that's a question that Angela Davis addressed in Our Prisons Obsolete, 2003 book. A lot of people support the prison industrial complex because they never imagined that it will happen to them. Mm. They think that we are the good guys, and the bad guys, if they do something wrong, then they should pay the price. But they don't recognize the extent to which the injustice of relying on colonial systems of control would do to everybody in the long run. And it's not completely baseless for people to support the prison industrial complex. Maybe they've been victims of crime. Maybe they know family or friends who have been victimized. Maybe they know a family member whose life was ruined by the drug habit, so that they are supportive of the war on drugs, and so on and so forth. But they don't recognize the extent to which the war on drugs does more damage than the drug habits themselves. Say in the Philippines, where the government has killed thousands of people in the war on drugs, whereas those drugs have not killed as many people. And some of the drugs like marijuana never killed anybody. Same thing in Mexico, where the war on drugs has killed tens of thousands of people, more than any of the drugs could have done by themselves. So that concern by people in the community to have a safe community, to avoid crime in their community, is something that is found in almost every community around the world. What they do not recognize is the extent to which law enforcement based on militarization is a big part of the problem of disorderly conduct in the community. So that addressing wrongdoings through reparative justice rather than punitive justice might be a way for us to restore some of the healing that is disrupted by criminology in our communities. I do recommend Angela Davis, Our Prisons Obsolete. Where I disagree slightly with Angela is where she talks about abolition as an alternative to the prison industrial complex, whereas I think abolitionism is the original method of dealing with crime in the community through community measures and forgiveness. The prison industrial complex is rather the alternative because it came more recently than in indigenous societies, where indigenous jurisprudence emphasizes healing and love and sharing in the community rather than punitiveness.
I think that there's a lot of fear amongst populations of people. There's one of the outcomes of media and the authoritative stereotypes about people, about things like the war on drugs, that narrative about the need for war, the narrative about the need for more punitive measures has created a great deal of fear within communities, which has then transpired to actually convince people that they need tougher, harsher, stronger. Otherwise, the typical response to reparative and restorative justice always dances around the idea that it's too soft, it's not going to do the job, it's not, love is not enough. I have a question from Benson. Do you think African literary works on colonial political prisoners are an excellent avenue for exploring the colonial criminology paradigm?
Yes, that can be done. I have done that. I have done radical criminology in African literature, an essay in International Sociology journal. And it's not only Africans who do that. Foucault used a lot of literature in his own work. I think he referred to, Macbeth, Lady Macbeth a lot. Karl Marx did so. Freud used a lot of literature, Greek classics for his own theory, and so on and so forth. So we should be open to use any literary work, whether they are creative writing or historical writing, to advance our theoretical paradigms and thinking. But it's not simply a problem for literature and decolonization struggles still ongoing that we need to identify with, support, and participate in as part of our criminological work. Nice question, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you for all your questions, insightful questions. I'd like to take the opportunity to give Professor Agozino a virtual round of applause. Say thank you for joining and for sharing your wonderful ideas about decolonization and counter-colonial criminology. Many of our attendees have expressed an interest in learning more about your work by perhaps getting a copy of your slides, and we discussed it a bit earlier. And so at this point, I'd like to say thank you all for joining us today. And I hope that somewhere along the line, some of the ideas are things that you could work with in your classrooms and in your research and in your activism. So thank you again, Professor Agozino. It was a pleasure to meet you. And I will continue to use your work and trumpet your logics throughout my research in my classrooms as we move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. And thank you
very much
for coming.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, I will send you this slide and then you can share with anybody interested.
Yes, if you have 5 minutes to stick around, that'd be lovely.
Yes, I am. I do.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was very insightful.
Nice to meet you.
It was lovely to meet you, and it was so wonderful that you responded and accepted the invitation that I sent out. I was hoping that you would have the time that you could share it, but I wasn't sure how busy you were. So yeah, the group, our historical criminology group. So I'm chair. The British Society of Criminology has these sub-networks, and I'm chair of the historical network for the next few years. And I'm trying to get ideas beyond the typical presenters who usually show up for these sessions. So it's really lovely to have insights from, just generally speaking, from logics, from case studies, you talk about Japan, you talk about the Netherlands, you talk about Australia, and too often all our examples are set. Well, it depends on if we're demonizing other people, we point to Iran. If we're trying to talk about our own superiority in the West, we point to Canada and England and America, and it's so. But I'm sure that you're aware of this. Yeah. So it was a real pleasure having the opportunity to have you address the group, because it doesn't happen very often that we look outside the confines of the thinking that takes place within customer criminological scholarship and all that narrowness of thought. So it was a pleasure. Thanks for that. I think I'll stop recording.
Yes,
actually.
thank you for